Brexit was not just about slogans on buses or bold talk of sovereignty regained. It was for many a direct punch to the gut, especially if you happen to be in the business of selling oysters, sausages, or cheddar across the channel. For years now, British exporters, particularly those in the food and drink sector, have been shackled by layers of bureaucracy, endless customs declarations, and enough paperwork to wallpaper the Palace of Westminster twice over. But wait and behold, a new glimmer of optimism has emerged, a fresh trade agreement between the UK and the EU that promised us to scrape off at least some of the Brexit-induced barnacles from Britain's battered economy. At the centre of this newfound hope is the shellfish industry, an unlikely hero in the post-Brexit drama. Take the case of Tom Hayward, whose family has been in the oyster business for over 2 centuries on Mersey Island. Like many British fishermen and farmers, he had once dreamed of exporting his produce to eager European markets, until Brexit yanked the anchor chain and left those dreams floundering in red tape. Overnight, what used to be a brisk trade with the continent became a logistical nightmare. Suddenly, oysters had to be depurated, certified, checked, and verified before they could even glance in the direction of Calais. Worse still, many European importers didn't want pre-cleaned shellfish, as their own systems were built to do that job, meaning Britain's ready-to-eat mollusks were now persona non grata. The mussel industry in North Wales, once thriving, was all but wiped off the economic map. And in short, Brexit had turned a straightforward export market into a Kafkaesque maze of bureaucratic absurdity. But with the new agreement, announced with considerable fanfare and cautious optimism, some of those barriers are set to crumble. While the details remain shrouded in the usual cloak of civil service ambiguity, the headlines are clear. Health and safety checks will be simplified, documentation requirements reduced, and trade flows, well, at least for food and drink, made somewhat smoother. Shellfish farmers, cheesemongers, and sausage makers across the British Isles have breathed a collective sigh of relief. And David Jarrett of the Shellfish Association of Great Britain said the majority of members were delighted, though naturally everyone's still waiting for the fine print. It could take up to 18 months before anything actually changes. And meanwhile, on Mersey Island, Mr. Hayward continues his family tradition, dredging oysters from the seabed and washing them in a hut that has stood longer than most of Westminster's current MPs have even been alive. Thanks to modern technology, he now sorts oysters with a laser and a highly sensitive scale, a blend of ancient tradition and quiet innovation that encapsulates so much of Britain's small business resilience. Before Brexit, about half of his oysters made their way to Europe. Today, many are sold at Borough Market in London, where hipster foodies queue to savor a bit of maritime heritage. Others end up in Billingsgate or shipped across Britain via mail order. For now, Hayward is cautiously optimistic. If trade with Europe can be renormalized without the layers of expensive, unpredictable nonsense that came with Brexit, then perhaps the dream of expanding the family business can live on. Britain's new agreement with the EU isn't the only deal in town. In the same fortnight, the government also secured trade pacts with India and the United States and is eyeing the Persian Gulf as the next prize, although everywhere fine print is missing. But it's a flurry of diplomacy designed to project one message loud and clear. Britain is open for business. Yes, as always, reality bites. Despite the enthusiastic press releases and carefully staged handshakes, the actual economic impact of these deals is likely to be modest at best. Michael Gasiorek, an economics professor at the University of Sussex, put it bluntly. These trade deals aren't going to turbocharge UK growth. The real constraints on the economy are domestic: poor infrastructure, low productivity, lack of investment, and skills shortages. In other words, no amount of tariff tinkering can solve Britain's deeper malaise. Still, for certain sectors, these deals could be a much-needed lifeline. Scotland's whisky producers are thrilled about India halving tariffs, and British car makers and steel producers are optimistic that the US deal could help them dodge punitive duties. But once again, implementation is key. None of these promises will mean anything until the agreements are ratified, operationalized, and, crucially, start producing tangible results. For smaller businesses like the Whitstable Oyster Company in Kent, the jury is still out. Once a thriving exporter of over 2.5 million oysters a year to France, Brexit gutted their overseas trade almost overnight. New EU rules, only new to Britain, about oyster cleaning rendered their products unwelcome. And owner James Green cut production and focused on British restaurants and wholesalers. And now, even with a new agreement, he is reluctant to dive back into the European market at lower prices and higher risk. You can't just open the faucet and expect trade to start flowing, he said, encapsulating the weary realism that many exporters now feel. And yet, there's a lesson here. While Brexit has undoubtedly bruised Britain's trading posture, it hasn't completely destroyed it. The nation's exporters remain adaptable, creative, and, when given half a chance, eager to rebuild lost relationships. And this new trade deal with the EU won't erase the damage done since 2016, but it might just stop the bleeding. It's a start, and in the post-Brexit world, sometimes a start is all you can hope for. The symbolic significance of this agreement too cannot be ignored. Where previous negotiations were often mired in ideological rigidity and blame games, this accord reflects a subtle but important shift toward pragmatism, an acknowledgement that proximity still matters and that doing business with your largest trading partner shouldn't require a PhD in customs law. In Parliament, the response has been predictably split. Hardline Brexiteers grumble about creeping alignment, warning that any move to ease trade friction with Brussels is a slippery slope back into the EU's orbit. But business leaders, and particularly those with supply chains that stretch across the channel, see this as a small but critical victory. The hope is that this marks a new phase in UK-EU relations, one that prioritizes function over posturing and common sense over confrontation. And whether that hope is realized will depend, as always, on the fine print, the timelines, and the willingness of both sides to engage in good faith. But for now, even a faint pulse of progress feels like a triumph. The oysters may never again sail up the Thames en masse, but perhaps in time they'll glide once more across the channel, not as symbols of lost glory, but as proof that cooperation, even after rupture, is still possible. And in a nation starved of good Brexit news, that alone is worth savouring.